All right, it's time to start our second panel on end use and serial production. So I'd like to introduce Erika Berg, Managing Director of Application and Business Development at Carbon. Erika, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kenny. Good morning, everyone. I'm Erika Berg, and I'm joining from Carbon. My team at Carbon works with OEMs to partner with them in understanding what their vision is for their products and helping them bring it to life using Carbon DLS technology. So we've partnered with brands like Riddell, CCM, Specialized to bring next generation helmets and saddles to market faster than they would have using traditional manufacturing methods. I'm going to be your moderator for today, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'll start with Eric. Eric, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, my name is Eric Folsom. I am the Director of Technology at HILOS. We are a consumer-driven digital manufacturer. We provide 3D printed footwear for today's market.
Thanks, Eric. Next, we'll go on to Dina.
Hi, my name is Dina Deresh, and I'm coming from Stanley Black & Decker. I'm the manager of the additive space that's being built in Fort Worth, and this is a new technology that's being brought to this company.
Thanks, Dina. And finally, Christian.
Yeah, hi, my name is Christian Beck. I'm with OECHSLER, and we are producing end-use parts, I would say in bigger amounts or mass production.
Wonderful. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. To kick things off, I'll start with a few questions. I do want to let all participants know that on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a section for Q&A. So if you click on the Q&A area in the chat, please feel free to type in your questions. And as we're going through the panel, I'll also be keeping an eye on the Q&A questions that come up from the audience and be bringing them to the panel. So I'll start, would like to hear from each of you. Tell us more about how you gained your passion for additive and entered into your respective fields. Christian, we'll start with you.
Okay, good. Yeah, I would say processing plastics since nearly 160 years. It was a logical step 15 to 20 years ago, yeah, to join the additive manufacturing community. And in the beginning, we did only I would say rapid tooling and rapid prototyping, and but we definitely got that additive is ramping up, and I would say by end of 2017 we've been approached by a big sporting goods OEM to do some production on some parts, and since this point we're I would say in the game of mass production.
Wonderful. Thanks, Christian. Eric, how about yourself? Tell us how you got into your field and some successes that you've seen as well.
Well, it's kind of a long story, but I'll make it very brief. I was in China. I actually got into the additive space when I was living in China. I lived in China for 6 years. It was in the early days of the Form Labs, Form 1 Plus, I think, if I remember correctly. And it was very premature. I was in the additive space, in the automotive space, doing a lot of stuff for several big brands, doing a lot of pre-prototyping and development on connectors and wiring harnesses at that point in time, but have moved more into the mainstream. About a year and a half ago, I was looking for kind of the next venture, and HILOS came about from fruition to, essentially from a conceptual design to fruition, what you see now. And it's been super exciting to be able to work in amongst geometries and work amongst polymers that aren't just rigid. They're TPU based, and to be one of the leaders when it comes to commercialization of the TPU for a commercial scale.
Thanks, Eric. Dina, how about yourself? How did you gain your passion or get into this field?
So my first introduction to AM was in my my first career out of college, and that was a carbon nanotube materials startup in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they had a really tough problem with conformal cooling for the reactor they were building. So that whole reactor was 3D printed, and at the time, that was maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, that was just crazy technology, and I was blown away. I was lucky enough after that role to move on to Tiffany & Co., and that was my real introduction to AM, where I learned pretty much everything I know right now. And in that role, I was able to see a 3D printing process go from essentially like startup development to a production scale. And so that's really where my passion started. And I was lucky enough to find Stanley Black & Decker and get into the role that I am now.
Nice. That's great to hear. Okay, well, I will start focusing on kind of more broader questions. I won't each time be going person to person. Would love to make this more interactive. And again, audience members would love to have you chime in with any questions that you may have now that you know the panel a little bit better. But the first area I'd like to really dig into is understanding from your perspective, how does additive affect the design process for products that you know are going to go into production? So not designing for prototyping or just a small batch run, but really thinking about production. What are the unique attributes that you take into consideration? Or what are some of the limitations that you no longer have to consider given you're not using traditional manufacturing methods during the design process?
I think I'll take the lead on that one.
Thanks,
In the cases with product, we talk about product from a process-driven process. And what I mean by that is typically we look at, okay, subtractive manufacturing. We say we have a product that can be designed by stamping, for example. It has to be stamped through a multiple process. It's either a single die or a progressive die, and then you get your finished product, as opposed to saying, and flipping the script a little bit and going from product to design process. So what I mean by that is that if you look at the end piece that you're trying to accomplish and kind of, as we say sometimes around the office, reverse engineer it, look at the entire aspects of everything you're trying to do in the finished product and then work backwards. With additive, it seems to be a more progressive kind of way of looking at how we actually design and put design product flows together. In our case, we're utilizing digital technology to be able to actually move beyond the threshold of looking at subtractive, moving into additive geometries, moving into aspects of being able to change what I would call micro geometries to be able to get a finished product, as opposed to the other way around, just being satisfied with over 100 years of manufacturing and saying, well, we're just going to do it this way because this is the way we've been doing it for the last 100 plus years.
And just to add on to that, one of the things that's been a real breakthrough is the ability, as you said, to see the part as you want it in the end. So one of the things that you can do with additive is create assemblies as a single part, rather than having to source, individual spacers, for example, that may be costly. So the thing that I really love about additive and how it really affects the consumer market is that you know what you want to send out there. And in the space of metals, which is where I'm kind of based, is metal 3D printing, there's a lot of difficult problems with processing blanks, sourcing blanks, for example, and then maybe striking or stamping. The things that need to be kind of considered, though, is that additive may look different, but that's not a bad thing. It just needs to be kind of taken into the whole design process for that end piece for consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What we find out in our business, which is, we are strongly related to injection molding, that sometimes we need to educate our customers not to think in the injection molding way. So we told them, we are able to develop parts in 2 lines, with the regular injection molding one, and then I think we are actually doing all A samples also for the automotive industry, additive manufactured. And so we can run several iteration loops. We can educate them on changing design. getting to new designs. Yeah, this, as already mentioned, it's a very conservative industry, but yeah, I think it's on all of us to consider them to rethink things.
Right.
Now.
Yep. And Christian, you mentioned something there about education, and I know the last time the four of us met, we all talked a bit about the education required to successfully launch products in production, whether that's from the early design process, how to think differently about designing for additive, or education on how quickly you can move or what capabilities can be opened. Christian, from your team's perspective, then we can loop back around, how do you use education, or how have you focused education within your teams or companies or with customers?
Okay, yeah, for sure you need to educate both sides, yeah, the teams inside the company and also the customers. Yeah, what did we do? Yeah, we had to find out for us internally which print technologies, which materials fits best to mass-produce parts, yeah, and end-use parts. To give you an example, we are, yeah, as mentioned, regularly approached by customers, yeah, with typical injection molding designs. Also, the tolerances on the sketches, yeah, on the graphs are, as we all know here, injection molding tolerances, yeah. And if you ask the guys on the other side, yeah, why is this tolerance this small? Most of the time they don't know, yeah. The tolerance has absolutely no impact on the function of the part. And yeah, another thing would be to get or to find out the right material. Yeah? In injection molding, you have your materials, you have your machine, you have your parameters, you'll get out a good part. And we internally did a lot of validation work to find out materials which comes close to the injection molded materials.
So it sounds like overall really understanding the true end requirements and why they need to be that way, whether it's tolerances or materials, because these are different manufacturing methods and end results, but ultimately still meets the needs of the end product and the customers. So
exactly,
that makes sense. Dean, you look like you were ramping up to mention something.
So there's different educations that need to be considered, and I completely agree with everything Christian said. There's the internal and then there's the external. And managing expectations on both ends, I think, is incredibly important. So internally, there's a big push at Stanley Black & Decker to give, let's say, designers an overview of what additive means for them. And really, that's where I think a huge impact could be made on the company, is opening up their imaginations to designing for additive, as you mentioned, but also designing parts that are already out there and Stanley parts that could be repurposed as additive parts, or, added cost savings for maybe, removing some volume or somewhere that you couldn't do in traditional manufacture. That's incredibly important. The other part of internal education is making sure that the people that are affected throughout the line, not just all the way up at the C-suite, but all the way down to operators and technicians. And the education there is that this is a new opportunity rather than something that is displacing or disrupting their work. So it is incredibly exciting for people that are in the know, but it could be scary to people that don't know. And then there's also the consumer aspect where, right now additive is a big buzzword in some cases, and it's an incredibly useful technology, but for a lot of consumers, it's kind of an unknown, or maybe they have a negative view of it from something that they saw on the internet. So right now, one of the big pushes I can see is that additive is seen as a luxury good. It's a lot of the companies are using additive in a luxurious sort of way, and that can trickle down over time and educate consumers that, it's not just for Formula One race cars, but it could be used in your day-to-day life as well.
Yes, that's a great point. Thanks for that perspective.
Well, and I'll add one extra on that one is that on the design aspect is design for additive can be very different from what it is to subtractive manufacturing. We can take and use base materials and change the micro geometries that are inside of it to change the properties completely. And I think that's one of the things that gets lost in very classical manufacturing when it comes to subtractive and sometimes even in additive. There's companies that are out there that are trying to use additive that are using it in a subtractive way. They're producing parts that are very subtractive in nature, not necessarily truly capitalizing and being able to move across a different scope. And what I mean by that is I mean that if you had a box that's printed in subtractive, if it's injection molded, it's going to have uniform geometry, uniform Young's modulus, uniform shape and form. If you do it additively, you could actually get the whole entire box to become squishy like steel wool, or even softer than that, like a sponge or foam. Or you can make it as hard as a rock and go beyond the scope and using something like, say, for example, a gyroid kind of infill, and you can shoot a bullet through it and it'll stop a bullet. So, I mean, there's a lot of different aspects to additive that when I speak about the end product, especially when it comes to education, is educating things beyond where we actually currently are in the cases of what it is with additive. And the shoes in particular we produce on our platform that just launched earlier this year, we've had people have glowing reviews of the actual shoes because they've never seen or felt or even, interacted with something that's so vastly different from a standard pair of shoes. But yet the material that we're using is the same materials that are actually used in sneakers. And so they're like, oh, well, it looks like a clog, but it feels like it's, beyond what it would be on a sneaker. And it also moves with your foot. It's a transitional, what I would call a transitional or extension of your actual human body when you're busy walking on the shoes. And that's just one example of what it is that we're doing currently in additive manufacturing.
Yes, absolutely. And Eric, you touched on different lattices, gyroids. I'd love to come back to that topic in a little bit. I do see a couple questions in the Q&A panel, so I'll bring those into the loop. One of them is from Brent. He's asking, is software today capable of driving your business from prototyping to production? Why, and are there gaps? I'll pause there and then I'll ask a couple more questions later. So really focus on software. How is it driving prototyping production? Why, and potentially what are the gaps?
Well, I can speak from our side. I'm not sure necessarily about with Christian and Dina, but there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of middleware. A lot of companies, even including companies like Link3D. Link3D is centered more on MES software, so it's more on the manufacturing process and not so much centered in build prep, understanding how to transition prototyping directly to an actual production. So they set the initial frame to be able to get you to production, but not necessarily, get you in production, but not necessarily get you primed to go to production. I would assume that their more recent acquisition, not to drop too many names in here, but I know that their recent acquisition with Materialize will probably start to look at some aspects of that. But across the industry as a whole, even what we're doing currently in the additive space, we're creating our own platform. We're creating a method to be able to transition from conceptual design to something that's ready for production, putting those things into place, from everything from dealing with lattice structures, dealing with structure from shoe to shoe, construction to construction. There's a lot of different aspects, and allows the designers to move from the very beginning to where it would be in the end. So there's a lot of middleware that has to be able to bridge those gaps.
I completely agree with the MES stuff. That is the biggest thing coming out for all of 3D printing, I think, right now is all that MES and material kind of following material through the process, especially in a metal 3D printing viewpoint, which is, I'm kind of focused on that. So it is a very tricky problem, and Link 3D is definitely disrupting there. There's other players, Materialize, for example, that are doing a really great job. The gaps, they are closing. There are gaps for sure, but they are getting smaller. And those are the types of technologies, and specifically in software, that are going to really change how effective 3D printing as a whole is for manufacturing.
Yeah, I would agree that there are still gaps, but I would say the suppliers improved during the last 1.5 years, definitely. So I think we are even close to get software tools on hand to do customized stuff, even in lattice. Yeah.
Okay.
My point of view.
Thanks, Christian. So I'd like to move forward with the prototyping to production question, because that was kind of a follow-on, but I think it's an interesting question to have in and of itself. So our audience member, Brent, asked, what are the gaps preventing the move from prototyping to production? But I'm interested to hear beyond software, right? So let's think about what are all the gaps, and maybe there are audience members that can help us all tackle going from just small designs and really scaling into production.
So the biggest gap that I am currently butting my head against is post-processing. So prototyping, before I get into post-processing, prototyping is an incredibly important step in getting to large-scale manufacture. And one of the things that I found helpful is having a smaller scale system as a test bed. And a lot of the larger manufacturing printers they don't always have the best first print or a startup on a new product or a new geometry. So having a much smaller scale to kind of base and develop a recipe on has been incredibly helpful. Then moving to production is generally easy once you have a recipe, but then you have parts that you need to post-process. And that post-processing is another gap, I think, that is going to be closing in the coming years. But in the more complicated geometries, you have this capability to create these amazing things that you couldn't make in traditional manufacture, but how do you finish them? Especially in lattices, right? There's so many nooks and crannies. Getting in there is very difficult. It's beautiful, I think, in some cases, especially with layer lines, and in metal it kind of shimmers, but not everybody's looking for that sort of a rough surface. And getting inside, even conformal cooling, there's some issues in getting all the way inside and cleaning those channels. And so if anybody is out there and developing ways to clean those crazy geometries that we are all thinking of right now, now is the time. Come out with it.
Yep.
Okay, I completely agree. And talking in polymers, if you do end-use products in mass production, you need to focus on every single step of the process, even on the pre-process. Yeah, so we in OECHSLER, we invested a lot of time and effort to create, I would say, an optimized infrastructure around the production process. We tried, and we are still trying to minimize labor and to get things at least in the post-process semi-automated. To I would say avoid human failures, to avoid environmental failures, because as I think I already mentioned it, one failure could cause a scrap part in the end.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of drivers when it comes to post-processing. I can speak from the polymer side of things, and especially dealing with TPU. TPU typically, when it's printed, is fairly caked. It's one of our biggest challenges across the entire scope. Is that TPU is it's not as friendly as a nylon. A nylon typically gets hard after the process of when it's actually being used. So when it gets done being printed, it's easy to remove the extra powder. And TPU, it's like a cake. Literally, it's stuck inside of everything, and it is challenging. So there's technologies that are out there right now, and it's stuff from glass bead blasting to using dry ice to using, I mean, any number of other ways, using fluids and having it tumbled around inside of a machine, like a dishwasher almost. So there's ways to be able to process it, but post-processing across the scope on average is probably the biggest challenge when it comes to dealing with additive parts, because some processes are very quick and some processes are very long. Contrary to what most people think when it comes straight out of the machine, there's still a fair amount of work to be done across the entire scope. And whether it's traceability and what it is in the process itself, or whether it's actually cleaning the parts, can really depend on how costly it can be to do an additive. And it kind of makes sense as to why more, as Dina had put it, higher end businesses are looking at the higher end products to be able to use additive as opposed to lower end products to be able to use an additive. At the moment, it's cost prohibitive.
Right. And Eric, you naturally transitioned us into the post-processing topic, and a number of people have been upvoting Janet's question, and it's around understanding the post-processing methods that you all have used to tackle some of the challenges you've seen in production, whether that's around texturing or wanting different colors, dyeing. So can you tell us and expand a little more on all the post-processing methods you've each used and how that has enabled you to tackle some challenges in post-processing?
I'll speak to that initially. I'll let my colleagues kind of jump in as they need to. In the cases with finishing is a very challenging aspect because typically most parts, at least in the polymer space, come out one color. And usually, in our case with MJF processing, MJF only means that you have a great part. You know, the general consumer doesn't want a standard gray part, especially when it comes to shoes. So we had to go through coatings, stuff from different companies for coatings, different processes that are using paints, and understanding how they adhere and how they bond. It is a very challenging part of the process to take into consideration. It can be very costly as well, because you have things that will bond very easily to TPU and other things that won't bond at all. You'll bend them and stretch them around, and so there's a very delicate balance as far as with how thick your coatings are. I mean, then you get into paints very similar to what's like an automotive in cars. You're not dealing with a hard surface. You're dealing with a soft surface that can move around and shift, and so you really have to take that fully into consideration. Dyeing, unfortunately, in MJF is more of a heathery kind of color. It's not necessarily such a bright color. So if you're trying to hit the hot pink, or you want to hit a neon green or one of those, you're not going to do that with the current process that's currently in dyeing. Because it just doesn't allow it, because the gray color underneath, it still has to seep into the material, but it's challenging because you have to figure out how do you manage that, and understanding about the transition and collaborative. We've got a lot of really great collaboratives that we work with on a regular basis, big companies and smaller companies as well, that help us get beyond that and work with us to kind of R&D some new components to be able to actually put onto our product, look at and see how it feels. Does it actually work and function the way it's supposed to? Then we run through mechanical testing. And so it becomes very, very challenging, but it's very rewarding when you see the end. So you see our shoes, and we have a hydro-dipped coating that's on the outside part of it. But it's not just that. It has to have a protective coat, like a clear coat on a car. And then it also needs a bonding coat underneath in order to get that to work properly. That's just one small example.
Yep. I agree on the MJF side. We as OECHSLER, we do have also the liquid resin in work, and there you need to wash the parts after the print, yeah, to get the liquid resin of the part. Then you have to air blast it. Then you have to UV cure it, or you have to bake it in an oven for several hours. And this is also, yeah, depending on the design of your part, sometimes you need to salt it, yeah, to put the parts into salt so that they don't twist in the oven. Yeah, that's what we are doing.
Okay.
So finishing for me is a little bit different because I'm not focused on plastic and more on metal. The big hurdles, the big hurdles for metal is creating a product that looks the same as wrought material or forged material. And layer lines, along with some of the other idiosyncrasies that come with metal 3D printing, end up being visible to the naked eye, and consumers generally expect a smooth surface. So the things that we have to really battle are those things that are like intrinsic to 3D printing, which is those layers and sometimes porosity. So we have been working really hard to increase the density of parts. The higher the density, the less you get those pores showing as you polish. The other things that we're lucky in this, and that the materials are known, right? Like steel is steel, no matter what you do to it, unless you're looking at maybe grain structure. But the same sort of finishing processes for traditionally manufactured parts in steel work the same for metal 3D printed parts in that material. So they plate the same, they polish the same. There's just we've been getting help, and I think Eric was saying that there's a lot of companies out there that are looking to help in finishing 3D printed parts, and we're seeing the same thing. And a lot of polishing companies are starting to focus on removing layer lines, which only show up in one of the axes. So all of that is, I can't really share like specifics, but all of those things are happening right now, and they are making metal 3D printed part processing a lot easier.
Thanks, Dina. I think now we'll transition on to, okay, after post-processing, let's look at quality and quality control. And there's a question from our panelists or our attendees. Kevin is wondering, how are PPAPs different from traditional versus additive manufactured parts? So PPAP, of course, standing for Production Part Approval Process. So if we're looking at quality, what's the approval process? It could be within, I know automotive is very strong in the PPAP process, but overall, let's expand this to quality control. How do you find quality control approval process different, whether you're working from traditional methods versus additive?
Yeah, in our business, if it's automotive end customer, it's I would say the same process than if you have an injected molded part. Definitely. For us. And yeah, I think we produced close to 3 million parts in additive manufacturing, yeah, till today. And I think 80% of them went through a 100% quality check after the production part. So
okay, so you're not seeing a lot of change.
Depends on the customer, yeah. So
okay.
normally we request would say a quality catalog where all the tests would be placed in, and then we have the capabilities in-house to do those testings, including computer tomograph, things like that.
Yeah, let me expand on that also as far as PPAPs when it comes to what we're doing as well. A lot of the industry, unfortunately, they're having some difficulties with like ASTM and UL and getting things certified. And those of us that are working additive realize that when you print parts in a 3D way, depending upon, I mean, no matter what aspect you take, is every single part is its own piece. It's not like it's an injection molded piece where you have 8 parts that are being shot at one time. And because it's its own piece, you have to establish a set of guidelines and evaluate what it is you're actually printing. So you look at it from a build box perspective, is typically what we do to be able to identify when we have issues and when we don't have issues. Because usually it's replicatable across the entire scope of the build box, not necessarily the parts. And I think that's one thing that gets lost a little bit, and sometimes in the education process, that really in additive, you have to look at every part as its own entity. And if you don't, it'll come and bite you in the butt. Because just as an example, printing on an HP MJF printer, you could have issues up in the top quarter of the actual box if you're printing in plastics and polymers. We know this because we profile the entire build box of the actual printer, and we use it as main part of our process for PPAP. It's not just about the part, it's about the part, the machine, the build box that's actually being built in. The whole entire process has to be part and taken into consideration. So then that way, when you get further down the line, you get a slew of 100 parts that are printed on multiple different build boxes. You know where to start. Otherwise, it's very difficult if you look at one individual part, because it's not shot as a collective. It's actually as its own individual.
Right. Dina, any thoughts there?
Yes. So PPAP is honestly something that is new to me, coming into management for the first time in the last 4 months. But the changes that I can see outright with the process is that there are a few extra steps that need to be taken into account. And PPAPs are pretty standard across the industry, but within additive, there's not much knowledge in a large company like Stanley how to handle it. So for us, the big change is that we end up having to inform and write what the PPAP process is, rather than following the exact PPAP process for some of the other traditional manufacturing methods that have been used. And that it includes, tolerancing before, let's say, plating. And that's, it happens in other manufacturing methods, but for us, it's a little bit different because we need to make sure that the parts come out at the right size out of additive. And it's slightly different in that case. But the things I can see changing is maybe using test parts, sort of, let's say, cubes or whatever, Sharpie bars, to check on the process and do what Eric was saying, is make sure that the test bed isn't changing. And by test bed, I mean print bed, isn't changing. And that is something that needs to be taken account when printing, and is that each printer is going to be different. It's going to have a different footprint, printing area, printing footprint, that sort of thing. So it's going to be challenging, but I think it's not insurmountable.
Great. I'm going to go to a couple more questions now from the group. One of them is, can you please elaborate on the technologies you use in series production? And I'm going to couple that with another question. So when you're talking about the technologies you're using, I'd also be interested to hear about your experiences in production when producing multiple individual parts at the same time within those technologies.
So multiple individual parts, it's not going to be happening too often in large production for what I am doing. However, the difficulty in having a large amount of individual pieces is tracking and serialization. When you're removing parts from the print bed in some manufacturing methods, it's hard to keep track of where they were if they're stacked, for example, which parts were on the bottom, which parts were on the top, and keeping those discrete throughout the rest of the post-processing that needs to happen. Mm-hmm. So in my experience, that has been the most challenging thing, is just, it's organization, but it ends up being really cumbersome when you have a large print area. So
we generally categorize our builds. So our builds are actually all completely digitized in what it is that we're doing. So if there's ever a point of reference, there's always a key number that's put on the part in some aspect somewhere. Of course, not visible to the consumer, of course. But in our process, we can always go back and reference where exactly the part was placed in the actual build out. Fortunately, I guess you say fortunately, but unfortunately, in the cases with what we're dealing with in shoes, you can't fit a lot in there when it comes to multiple different shoes in an actual build. not necessarily having small, tiny little parts. But you know, that may move to a different aspect in the future, but we do catalog every single part that actually is put into a build. And this gets back to the bit about the PPAP. The PPAP itself and profiling is probably our biggest tool and our biggest headache, because of the fact we profile the entire build out of the entire space. And it's a little different for what we do in the MJF process, because essentially it's a cake. And it's like deciphering a cake that you bake in the oven. Not necessarily used in the same aspect as, say, DLP, which DLP, you have a flat plate and everything kind of hangs from it. We actually have a stack cake where it's across multiple different layers, and we have all these parts that are being built at the same time frame. So we have to look at it by process, you know, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And I can say for serial, I guess you say high mix, low volume kind of serialization, what we're doing currently, it works really, really well in our aspects of what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, same with us. So on the DLP side, we do not have very often different parts on a platform. We sometimes have it on multi-jet fusion, but as we are looking for high volume production, not that often. Sometimes we have a set for, yeah, maybe a supplier of white goods with different geometries, but not that often. I think it happens more often if you are a print bureau or a print shop.
But when you guys are all looking at serial production at scale, you're really focused on making those parts over and over again.
It's not our approach to be a print shop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Per
Okay.
print shop, yes.
Yes. Pivoting a little bit, I'd like to understand or hear your perspectives on what do each of you think is currently holding back the consumer industry from faster adoption of use of additive in mass production?
I think it's, I'll touch on that. I think it's understanding. I think the biggest thing is that most of the consumer industry, in most regards, from what people that I've spoken to, is they try to use additive for subtractive manufacturing. And what I mean by that is that, you know, additive is a very short, I guess a short experience or a short timed manufacturing process. It's only been around for about 30 years. And they compare it to a 100-year-old process, of which you can't really do that, because the things that are in additive are very vastly different. We can change geometries at a microstructure level that you could never do or even think about on a subtractive manufacturing level. So you have to take in full consideration the product. You know, what is it that I want it to do? What exactly is it that, you know, the consumer is expecting? You know, what exactly is the price point that they're looking for? Because with additive at the moment, because things are a bit cost prohibitive for lower cost markets, some things don't make sense. And that's the way we should take that approach with additive, is that additive should be used in its own capacity. You know, it's one of those things that even companies like GE is restructuring their motors, where they took a part motor. It was actually just in a white paper recently, so I can speak to this, that they took a motor that was 833 parts and turned it down into 12 modules. And that's the kind of things that additive can do for the rest of the world. We've done the same thing with our shoes. We've taken a shoe that classically has about 12 parts to it and turned it into two to three, depending upon how you look at it. So additive, I think, it's kind of its own animal. I think, and that's the way it should be considered, that you can try to compare it directly to subtractive manufacturing, but are you really doing it any justice other than trying to compare it to something that's over 100 years old? Instead of saying, this is a new process, we can do things that are been never possible before. Case in point to Dina, in the cases with metals, you know, if you're going to use metal additive for your business, you can do things like put steel and copper together, which you've never been able to do in the same part. You can actually have it copper in the inside and steel on the outside, which physically in subtractive manufacturing is not even possible, because you can't weld the two of them together. So those are the things that I think are kind of in impacting additives adoption, because we're still kind of stuck. We're still stuck in this time frame of we want to use subtractive to try use additive to get rid of subtractive, when really they have to complement each other. And part of additive manufacturing across the scope for us to move ahead all has to be that way as a collaborative, in my mind.
And that's where the education piece really comes in too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dina, what are your thoughts on what's holding back the industry?
I completely agree with everything Eric said. Things I would like to add, though, I mean, cost of entry was touched upon, but it's not just the cost of the system, it's the cost of all the auxiliary equipment and the facility. For additives, for metal additives specifically, there's a lot of safety concerns. And so that can be kind of a large hurdle for a new business to take on when, they look at a 3D printing website or a manufacturer's website and they see this, really fancy single piece. What they don't see is the disaster of a lab that it's sitting in with all of the powdering and, various safety measures that need to be taken, whether they need to wear safety gear and make sure everybody's in Tyvek suits. All of that is kind of not advertised. And when they see that price tag on top of the, $1 million instrument, that is a bit of a shocker, especially when finding the right parts to print is also very difficult, because in a lot of cases, traditional manufacture has been created for each part to be as cheap as possible. So it's a race to the bottom. And choosing the right SKU is incredibly important, SKU or part. It's incredibly important. And so those parts that are difficult to get rid of for a business, but maybe they're low volume, they're not making a lot of money, those are the things that should be targeted. And maybe that's how a business case could be built for adopting additive in metal or in whatever material. But
Yeah, completely agree. I would say the very often very conservative industries out there are, they are recognizing additive manufacturing still as only a prototyping method, and it's often still more expensive than the traditional manufacturing methods. And I think, if you couldn't create a significant benefit, then the customer will normally stay with a cheaper solution, at least here in Germany.
Right. So I want to come back to, I know earlier, and I'm keeping an eye on time, but I know earlier we said we'd come back to latticing. And I do want to touch on overall, what do you view as unique advantages that additive unlocks? If you'd like to focus on latticing, that's one area. There's also a question in the panel about using serial numbers or printing QR codes on parts. So generally, I'm interested to hear from each of you, what do you think additive really unlocks? What unique either capabilities or features does it enable, and how have you used those features?
If I could start, the thing that additive has unlocked for me and for Stanley is the ability to print what you imagine rather than having to create based off of the machines available. And I think that was touched upon earlier, but that is really the real breakthrough here. There's been a lot of work put into making a certain part a certain way, but now you can make all the parts on a single machine with very similar post-processing needs. So the capabilities, internal geometries that wouldn't be able to be made any other way, or very painstakingly and hands-on way, and various material properties that you couldn't harness before. So, for example, this is not a real thing. Maybe it will be one day, but let's say you could make a hammer out of metal, like all the way from the head to the handle. But then there's a damping effect in the middle of the handle, so you don't actually feel the strike, but you make that hammer all as one piece. That's a possibility. And there's a whole lot of other material properties, and Eric touched upon that in plastic, is that you can make something spongy, you can make it hard, you can remove material and actually increase performance rather than keeping it as a solid part. There's just so much. And the thing I'm really hoping is, now that there's a lot of education in schools and all that, is that people start thinking that way rather than thinking like, how do I make this with my hands? It's a different kind of artisanal and artistic approaches to creating things.
Well, I'll expand that as well. And our shoe is a very classic example of what you can do in additive versus subtractive. The shoe itself was conceived, the idea was kind of conceived back in the 1940s by Ferragamo. And what he had tried to do is he tried to sandwich these layers in order to be able to get a shoe that actually would cup to your foot and would move. And it sounds like a very basic, simple idea, but the problem that he ran into was delamination. So as the shoe and people would walk on the shoes, they would start to fall apart. You know, it's a very classic example when you try to sandwich multiple layers together. Well, what we've done in the cases with the shoe is we've taken a few steps beyond that. We've taken that idea and we've now put together an idea that we can pull the shoe together and make it 100% recyclable. We're only using really two components, which is TPU and leather. And so it's comfortable to the end user, but we've taken it far beyond that because now we've created the digital mesh that's inside of there, or the lattice. And that lattice itself will provide comfort and spring and support, along with the shoe moving with the actual foot. So a standard shoe is built from the ground to the foot as opposed to the foot to the ground. And there's a very big difference between the two, because transitional gating in your foot changes if you're actually forced to put your foot in a certain position, as opposed to having something that moves with you when you actually move and walk on the actual ground. And that's exactly what our shoe does, because if you look at the natural positioning of your foot wants to spread when it actually is touching the ground. The shoe is doing exactly the same. So it moves in conjunction to your foot. It's like an extension of your foot. And we can do that in additive manufacturing that you could never dream of in subtractive manufacturing.
And what I see, especially in lattice, is that you can, I have some parts here with me, that you can create the function in the parts, by choosing the cell size, choosing the thickness of the struts, stuff like this, creating different compression zones in one part. So that's what we are doing in OECHSLER, and I think lattice is also, if you would ask me what is the most promising application for the future, I would say it's lattice. Definitely.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. I will wrap up with one last question around the horn, and just want to summarize and say thanks so much to each of you for joining. Throughout the last hour, we've covered how to think about designing for scale production. We've talked about the printing process, post-processing, quality control, leveraging additive for unique attributes. We've covered so many topics. There's obviously a wealth of knowledge with this collective group. And what I'd really like to ask as we wrap up now is, what is a key takeaway you want our audience members to take from each of you in terms of using additive for creating consumer products at scale? So if someone walks away with one thing, whether it's a tip or a learning lesson that you have, or some form of encouragement, what would you like to just wrap up our session with today? Christian, we'll start with you.
Yeah, for me, it's definitely that additive manufacturing is not longer only prototyping. So we have the capabilities today to do mass production, and I think we all should tell this to the outer world. Yeah. Great.
Dina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I want everybody to know that the technology is there. It's ready. For the past, 10 plus years, it's been a huge thing in the background, a buzzword, but it is ready right now, and it's the time to jump into it. There's a lot of hurdles still out there, but the more people that get on this train, the more problems are going to get solved, and the easier it's going to get for everyone. And we're going to change manufacturing starting today. So get
Absolutely. On here. Yep. And Eric, your last thoughts.
My last thoughts are don't be discouraged by what it is that's going on in additive, and use it to your advantage. Use it as a collective to be able to work together. Use the things that we've learned, unfortunately, that happened with the circumstances of COVID-19, and use that to your advantage to work collectively together to be able to make a better world.
Absolutely. Well, cannot thank you, each of you, enough for joining us. And I think now Janet will take it over.
Thank you so much, Erika from Carbon, Christian from OECHSLER, Dina from Stanley Black & Decker, and Eric from HILOS for sharing your insights about how you could build and scale your mass production efforts. And it was so fascinating to hear the different areas, like you mentioned, Erika, just now, educating the team from the internal, external, getting folks bought in, not only on the C-suite level, but also on the operational level, and how to educate the consumers, along with some of the challenges we need to face, not only on the software side, to build that connectivity between hardware and software systems, overcoming some of the post-processing challenges. We're looking at you guys on the floor, so help us get there, our additive manufacturing vendors. We're also excited about how there's a lot more solutions to support quality enablement, traceability, not only for mass production, but also high mix, low volume as well. And how Lattice is one of the most promising features of additive manufacturing, and how that can enable performance, comfort, especially for our consumer organization. So we really appreciate all of your key takeaways today, and hope more folks can learn from your experiences. So thank you so much for advocating for additive manufacturing for the consumer space. Also really excited that we will now go into the virtual networking environment. So we will all be thrown onto the virtual floor, where you'll see tables across multiple floors, so floors 1 to 9. Floors 1 and 2 will be designed for you to connect with organizations that are supporting the community. Feel free to ask them any questions you want by turning on your camera and mic. And after this, in about 30 minutes, we will be starting our panel on tooling, and we'll have Patrick Dunn from 3D Systems, Mandana from Lego, Gianluca from Estee Lauder, and Kevin, former Danfoss, but also a dyno from AMUG, who will be joining us to share with us their expertise. Thank you, everyone, for speaking today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Bye.